Long before history needed witnesses, Earth learned to stay still. In that patience, ancient Egypt quietly emerged, not as destiny, but as a place where nothing needed to hurry. If these quiet historical stories help you slow your breathing and settle into the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Please subscribe gently to support long-form storytelling without noise, urgency, or spectacle. Following the channel helps preserve this calm, patient space where history whispers instead of shouting. Your presence allows more nights like this to continue, more stillness, more time, more careful listening. There's no rush. Return whenever the world feels too loud. We'll be here waiting whenever you need rest. Before Egypt had a name, before stone learned to stack itself into meaning, before anyone thought to look at a river and call it generous, there was time. Not historical time. Just time doing what it does best. Passing quietly, without witnesses, without urgency, without even the courtesy of asking whether anyone was ready. Earth did not arrive with an announcement. It did not rehearse. It formed slowly, clumsily, colliding with itself, cooling in stages, adjusting its posture again and again, until movement became unnecessary. There was no audience waiting for this moment. No one was counting years. No one cared if the process was elegant. It simply happened and then continued happening, long after drama lost interest. For a very long while, nothing needed to be remembered. Rocks cooled, water stayed. The surface stopped rearranging itself every few minutes. Earth learned restraint. It discovered that not changing too much was surprisingly effective. Volcanoes quieted down. Oceans found their edges. The planet did not rush toward life. It allowed life to show up eventually, as if by accident, then waited to see if it would stay. This patience mattered. It created the conditions for repetition. Days followed nights without improvisation. Seasons appeared, left, and returned without personality. The planet settled into habits. These habits were not impressive, but they were reliable, and reliability turned out to be far more important than brilliance. There was still no Egypt. There was not even the idea of a place that might someday become Egypt. But the foundation was quietly forming. Somewhere on this unassuming surface, geography was practicing consistency. Climate stabilized just enough to be predictable. Land learned where it preferred to remain dry. Water learned where it preferred to return. Nothing here felt important yet. And that was precisely the point. History loves beginnings that look intentional. Earth offered none. It did not set out to create civilization. It did not prepare a stage for monuments or dynasties. It merely slowed down. And in doing so, it made space for something rare. A place where change would arrive slowly, politely, and usually on schedule. Much later, people would mistake this for destiny. They would call it extraordinary. But at the start, it was only patience. A planet learning to stay still long enough for someone, someday, to notice that staying had advantages. Egypt would come later. For now, there was time. And time was in no hurry at all. A land that didn't argue with change. Long after the planet learned how to stay still, it began experimenting with where stillness might last the longest. Not everywhere qualified. Some places shook too often, others froze, flooded, burned, or rearranged themselves with enthusiasm. Stability, it turned out, was rare, and rare things tend to go unnoticed for a very long time. Northern Africa did not begin as a promise. It was not chosen. It simply found itself spared from extremes often enough to remain familiar. The ground did not surprise anyone. The sky behaved most days. The horizon stayed where it had been yesterday. This was not luxury. It was consistency, and consistency is quiet. Wind shaped sand slowly, as if it had nothing better to do. Rain arrived rarely, which made it memorable but not disruptive. Heat lingered without demanding explanation. The land did not resist these conditions. It adjusted, accepted them, and then stopped negotiating. Over time, the region developed a personality best described as cooperative. What mattered was not that this land was rich, it was that it was predictable. The soil learned how to wait. The climate learned restraint. Change still happened, but it happened gently, like someone rearranging furniture in the dark and returning everything to the same place by morning. This created a strange effect. The land stopped demanding attention. There were no dramatic shifts to respond to. No urgent migrations required. People, when they finally arrived, did not feel chased or threatened. The landscape did not ask them to hurry. It invited them to stay, casually, without commitment. Elsewhere, survival required constant adjustment. Here, survival rewarded memory. Remember where water had been. Remember when the heat softened. Remember how long things usually lasted. Knowledge accumulated not through crisis, but through repetition. Still, there was no Egypt yet. No villages, no fields. Just a place practicing patience, unaware it was becoming suitable for something long-lasting. Geography does not plan ahead. It simply repeats what works until something notices. Eventually, humans would mistake this calm for generosity. They would speak of gifts and blessings. In reality, the land was simply consistent. It did not give more than expected. It did not take suddenly. It behaved the same way long enough for people to stop worrying. And when people stop worrying, they begin to build habits. When habits survive multiple generations, history finally starts paying attention. But that comes later. For now, this land was still learning how to remain itself. And the planet, quietly approving, allowed it to continue unchanged. The river that kept coming back. The Nile did not arrive with intention. It was not designed to support anyone, impress anyone, or explain itself. It flowed because gravity suggested it should, and because water rarely argues with gravity for very long. Long before it carried boats or stories, it carried silt, repeating the same quiet gesture year after year. Most rivers rush. They carve, destroy, wander, and change their minds. The Nile did something far less dramatic. It returned. Again, and again, and again. Each year, it stepped out of its banks, spread itself thinly across the land, and then withdrew, leaving behind exactly what it had brought. No surprises, no commentary, just residue and timing. This was unusual. Rivers are often unreliable companions. They flood too much, too little, or not when expected. The Nile developed a reputation for arriving on schedule, not perfectly, just reliably enough to be trusted. Trust is a powerful thing. It encourages people to stop moving. At first, there were only visitors, small groups passing through, resting briefly, leaving before commitment became necessary. But the river kept returning. The land kept accepting it. Nothing dramatic happened when people stayed longer than planned, and so they stayed longer still. The river taught patience without speaking. It showed that waiting had benefits. That time could be divided. That seasons could be anticipated. This was not wisdom passed down in words. It was learned by watching water behave the same way twice. Soon, memory mattered. Knowing when the water would rise became more useful than knowing where to run. Predictability rewarded attention, not speed. People adjusted their lives around the river's habits rather than attempting to change them. It was easier that way. There was still no civilization, no grand design, just repetition slowly becoming routine. The river did not demand belief, it required observation, and observation over enough years becomes understanding. Later generations would call this relationship sacred, symbolic, meaningful. At the time, it was simply practical. The Nile did not ask for gratitude. It returned regardless. And in that quiet reliability, something rare began to form, a place where staying made more sense than leaving, and where time itself seemed willing to cooperate. Egypt was not awake yet, but the river was already doing most of the work. When staying stopped feeling temporary. At some point, without ceremony or agreement, staying stopped feeling like a pause. No one announced it. There was no moment where people gathered and decided to become permanent. It happened the way habits always do, quietly, almost by accident, after being repeated too many times to abandon. People returned to the same places because the river did. They rebuilt shelters because nothing discouraged them from doing so. The land did not punish memory. It rewarded it. Each year felt familiar enough to trust. Familiarity softened fear. Fearlessness made movement unnecessary. This was not ambition, it was efficiency. Traveling required effort. Staying required attention. Attention turned out to be cheaper. Slowly, tools began to wait where they had been left. Paths reappeared. Storage mattered more than speed. People learned where shade would be at certain hours, where the ground stayed cool, where water lingered just long enough. The environment did not change its mind often, which meant people did not have to either. This was new. Most of human existence had been defined by movement. Here, movement became optional. Staying did not feel risky, it felt sensible. And sensible decisions, when repeated, tend to reshape everything around them. Time began to organize itself, not formally, just practically. Days developed purposes. Seasons gained expectations. The future stopped being abstract and became something that could be prepared for with modest confidence. Nothing extravagant. Just enough planning to make tomorrow feel manageable. From the outside, this might look like progress. From the inside, it felt like relief. No one thought they were starting a civilization. They were simply reducing uncertainty. They stayed because staying worked. They repeated what worked because repetition was easier than reinvention. Over generations, this logic accumulated quietly, until structure appeared without anyone noticing it had arrived. Later, historians would search for origins, causes, turning points. They would want a moment where Egypt began. There was none, there was only staying, repeated long enough to stop feeling temporary. And when staying becomes normal, history begins, whether anyone is paying attention or not. When time finally noticed what was staying. By the time anyone thought to look back, something unusual had already settled in place. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It simply refused to disappear. Generations passed, and the pattern held. People were born, grew older, and left behind familiar marks. Not monuments, just continuity. The rarest achievement of all. This was the moment when time itself began to pay attention. Until now, everything had been preparation without intention. The planet slowed, the land stabilized. The river repeated itself faithfully. People stayed because leaving made less sense each year. None of this required names. None of it needed memory beyond usefulness. But repetition, when it lasts long enough, becomes recognizable, and what is recognizable eventually becomes history. What emerged here was not brilliance but endurance, not innovation but restraint. While other places changed quickly and forgot themselves just as fast, this one practiced being the same. That sameness created confidence. Confidence allowed coordination. Coordination allowed structure to form without force. This is where the story begins to resemble something familiar. Fields were no longer experiments. They were expectations. Storage stopped being temporary. Time was divided deliberately. Tasks were shared, not because anyone demanded it, but because it reduced effort. Order appeared not as authority, but as convenience. People noticed that cooperation made the days quieter. Quiet days add up. There was still no Egypt in the way we imagine it. No symbols, no grand claims, but the shape of something lasting had formed. A society that trusted tomorrow, a population that planned just far enough ahead to remain calm, a place where the future did not feel threatening. This was the true foundation. Later stone would rise, names would be recorded, power would learn how to speak loudly, but all of that rested on something far less impressive, a long agreement between land, water, and people to behave predictably. Egypt did not begin with greatness. It began with patience that outlived everyone who practiced it. And now, finally, history is ready to talk about it. Why this part of Earth never hurried. Long before it was called North Africa, this land already had a habit of not rushing. It did not compete, it did not push outward, it did not reinvent itself every generation. While other regions of the planet experimented with extremes, cold that demanded movement, rain that arrived violently, ground that shifted without warning, this place practiced something far less dramatic. It stayed recognizable. The climate here was not generous, but it was consistent. Heat arrived when expected. Dryness lingered without apology. Rain was rare enough to be remembered, but not chaotic enough to cause panic. The land did not overwhelm. It simply asked for attention. And attention, unlike speed, can be sustained for a very long time. Geographically, this region sat in an unremarkable position, open enough to be accessible, protected enough to avoid constant invasion by climate itself. Deserts framed it without crushing it. The sea waited nearby without intruding. Nothing forced sudden adaptation. Nothing demanded immediate escape. Change occurred, but slowly, politely, as if aware that repetition was more useful than surprise. This created a rare condition, a landscape that did not pressure its inhabitants to keep moving. Most places on Earth taught humans to leave quickly or suffer. This one suggested something else, that learning its rhythms might be easier than outrunning them. It was not an invitation exactly, more like a lack of resistance. The ground here did not insist on transformation. It did not flood unpredictably. It did not freeze. It did not burn everything it touched. Instead, it offered a narrow range of challenges and repeated them patiently. Over time, patience becomes readable. Readable environments reward memory. Memory rewards staying. There is a quiet irony in how this stability worked. It did not feel comfortable. It felt manageable. And manageability is often mistaken for insignificance. No one arrived here thinking they had found greatness. They found a place that behaved the same way twice, then 3 times, then often enough to feel familiar. North Africa before Egypt was not waiting to become anything. It was not preparing for civilization. It was simply refusing to change too quickly, and in a world that usually demanded constant adjustment, that refusal was rare. Civilizations do not always rise because conditions are perfect. Sometimes they last because conditions are predictable. This land did not offer abundance, it offered continuity. And continuity, when given enough time, becomes the most powerful resource of all. Egypt would later be seen as extraordinary, but its foundation was quiet. It rested on a part of earth that never hurried because it never needed to. A climate that rarely raised its voice. The climate of this region did not make speeches. It did not demand attention or insist on reaction. Most days it behaved the same way it had the day before, and the day before that, as if it saw no reason to surprise anyone. Heat arrived quietly and stayed long enough to be understood. Cold appeared briefly, then excused itself. Rain was infrequent, but when it came, it did not arrive with chaos. It arrived, did what it needed to do, and left. This kind of restraint is easy to underestimate. It does not feel generous, it does not feel dramatic, but it creates something rare. An environment that does not keep people alert out of fear. Instead, it allows them to relax into observation. In many places, weather teaches urgency. Storms force movement, cold forces migration, excess forces destruction. Here, the climate taught patience. It did not reward speed, it rewarded memory. Knowing what usually happened mattered more than reacting to what suddenly changed. Days unfolded with small variations, never enough to be alarming. Seasons followed one another, with a reliability that slowly became familiar. The sky did not experiment much, it preferred routine. And routine, when repeated often enough, stops feeling like a condition and starts feeling like a background. This background mattered. It allowed people to plan without anxiety. You could expect tomorrow to resemble yesterday closely enough to prepare for it. Not perfectly, but well enough. That margin was important. It reduced fear. And when fear recedes, attention has room to grow. The land did not promise comfort. It promised manageability. Survival was never effortless, but it was not constantly threatened either. Work mattered, but panic did not. Effort was required, but improvisation was optional. This balance made stillness practical. There is a quiet irony here. A climate that never raised its voice also never asked for praise. It did not advertise itself as suitable for long-term settlement. It simply behaved consistently, year after year, until consistency itself became an advantage. People living within this climate learned to notice patterns rather than emergencies. They learned when heat softened, when it hardened again, when rest was reasonable, when work was tolerable. Over time, this knowledge accumulated gently, without instruction or urgency. Stability rarely announces itself as opportunity. It usually feels dull. But dullness, in the history of human survival, often signals something precious. It means nothing is forcing you to leave. And in this quiet, uninsistent climate, leaving stopped feeling necessary. Geography that didn't push back. Geography here did not challenge people into greatness. It did something far less dramatic. It stayed out of the way. The land did not rise suddenly into obstacles or collapse into traps. It unfolded gently, as if arranged for familiarity rather than conquest. You could look across it and understand it without effort. That alone made it unusual. There were no forests thick enough to hide danger, no mountains eager to block passage, no terrain that required constant recalculation. Movement across this land was possible without tension. You could walk without negotiating with every step. You could return to the same place and recognize it immediately. Orientation was simple. Memory worked here. This ease did not inspire adventure. It discouraged unnecessary motion. When the landscape does not resist you, there is no reward in overcoming it. There is only the quiet option of staying where things already make sense. Elsewhere, geography demands attention through difficulty. Here, it offered cooperation through predictability. The ground was firm enough to build on without constant repair. It did not collapse unexpectedly or insist on reinforcement. Structures, even simple ones, had a chance to remain where they were placed. That chance mattered. The land did not push people to test themselves against it. It invited them to learn it instead. Paths formed because they could. Settlements lingered because nothing forced them to move. Geography rewarded familiarity more than strength. Knowing where you were mattered more than proving you could get somewhere else. This created a subtle shift in how effort was spent. Energy went into refinement rather than escape. People adjusted details instead of reinventing their lives. Tools improved because they could be kept. Knowledge accumulated because it did not become obsolete overnight. There is something quietly humorous about this. A landscape so cooperative rarely earns credit. It is not impressive. It does not produce heroic stories. It produces continuity. And continuity, while deeply unexciting, is the condition civilizations secretly depend on. The land did not ask to be shaped. It allowed shaping to happen slowly, cautiously, without protest. This absence of resistance meant that changes could be modest and still effective. Small improvements lasted. Small decisions mattered. Over time, these modest adjustments added up to something stable. Stability, once achieved, tends to protect itself. People notice when staying works better than leaving. They stop testing alternatives. They invest in what already exists. Geography, by refusing to push back, made that investment feel safe. This was not destiny. It was convenience, repeated. A land that did not hurry made it easier for people to stop hurrying as well. And when people stop hurrying, they begin to build lives that expect to last. A place that was never forced to change. Some places on Earth are shaped by pressure. They change because they must. Floods arrive without warning. Cold tightens suddenly. Ground shifts, burns, collapses, or disappears. Survival in those places depends on constant adjustment. You move, or you fail to keep up. This place was different. Here, change was not aggressive. It arrived slowly, often predictably, and usually with enough notice to be understood. The land did not force reinvention every season. It allowed continuity. You could do the same thing twice and expect similar results. That alone reduced the need for urgency. Nothing insisted on improvement. Nothing demanded innovation for its own sake. Tools could remain useful for long stretches of time. Shelters did not require constant redesign. Skills mattered because they stayed relevant. Knowledge did not expire quickly. This gave people permission to settle into what they already knew. There is a quiet comfort in an environment that does not constantly question your decisions. When mistakes are not punished immediately, learning becomes gentle. Trial does not feel dangerous. Correction can happen slowly. Over time, this softness toward error encourages patience rather than fear. The land did not promise safety. It promised tolerance. You could misjudge slightly and still recover. You could plan imperfectly and still survive. This margin allowed people to stay calm. Calm people make fewer desperate decisions. Because the environment did not escalate problems quickly, problems stayed manageable. Scarcity existed, but it did not usually arrive all at once. Difficulty accumulated gradually, allowing response rather than panic. Life here did not feel like a sequence of emergencies. It felt like a series of adjustments. There is an irony worth noticing. A place that never forced dramatic change also never pushed people toward dramatic stories. Nothing heroic was required, no constant fleeing, no urgent reinvention. From a distance, it might look uneventful, but uneventful environments are precisely where long-term thinking becomes possible. Change still happened. It simply happened slowly enough to be absorbed. When climate shifted, it did so over generations. When land transformed, it did so politely, leaving time for memory to adapt. This pace mattered. It meant that continuity could survive change instead of being erased by it. Over time, people learned that adaptation did not require haste. It required attention. Watching carefully worked better than acting quickly. Waiting became a reasonable strategy rather than a dangerous one. This was rare. Most of the world did not allow this kind of patience. Most places demanded reaction. This one allowed observation. And when a place allows observation long enough, it begins to shape how people think about time itself. The rare advantage of being unrushed. When all these conditions gathered together, climate that rarely shouted, land that did not resist, change that arrived slowly. Something unusual happened. Time itself began to behave differently here, not faster, slower, and in that slowing, a quiet advantage appeared. In most places, time feels like pressure. You feel pushed forward, forced to respond, required to keep up. Here, time felt more like space. It allowed pauses. It tolerated repetition. It did not punish hesitation. Days passed without insisting they be used efficiently. Seasons returned without demanding innovation. Life unfolded without constant deadlines. This absence of urgency shaped behavior in subtle ways. People did not rush decisions because rushing offered no clear benefit. Acting quickly did not improve outcomes. Acting carefully did. Attention became more valuable than speed. Memory became more useful than impulse. This did not create brilliance. It created steadiness. There is something quietly ironic about how this worked. A land that never hurried also never asked to be noticed. It did not advertise itself as ideal. It did not present obvious rewards. It simply made continuity possible. And continuity, unlike conquest or discovery, rarely earns admiration until it has lasted a very long time. People living here were not thinking about permanence. They were thinking about tomorrow. But tomorrow kept arriving in familiar ways, and familiarity slowly changed expectations. When you expect the future to resemble the past, you begin to invest differently. You build things meant to last a little longer. You plan tasks that extend beyond the next few days. You store instead of consume. You coordinate instead of scatter. None of this required ambition. It required trust. Trust that the land would not betray memory. Trust that time would not suddenly turn hostile. Trust that staying was not a mistake. This trust was fragile at first. It was tested quietly, season by season. But each time the land behaved as expected, confidence deepened. And confidence, when shared, becomes culture. This is how a region becomes suitable for something enduring, not through abundance, not through dramatic advantage, but through the rare gift of predictability. A place that does not hurry gives its inhabitants permission to imagine continuity. Egypt did not exist yet, but the conditions that would allow it to exist without constant disruption were already in place. The land had done its work simply by remaining itself. The climate had contributed by refusing to escalate. Geography had cooperated by staying readable. Time had agreed to slow down. Later, people would build monuments and claim eternity. But long before that, the most important foundation had already formed, a part of Earth that never hurried, and therefore never forced anyone else to. And in that quiet agreement between land and time, the possibility of Egypt finally became real. The Nile before it had a name. A river that did not introduce itself. Before the river was noticed, it already existed. Long before it carried meaning, it carried water. Long before it was trusted, it simply flowed. The Nile did not arrive with explanation or intention. It did not pause to declare its importance. It moved downhill, quietly obeying gravity, as rivers tend to do when they are not trying to be remembered. At this stage, there was no Egypt waiting for it, no settlements aligned with its banks, no calendars depended on its behavior. The river was not central, it was incidental. It flowed whether anyone was watching or not, and for a long time, no one was. Most rivers introduce themselves dramatically. They rush, they cut, they announce their presence through noise and destruction. The Nile behaved differently. It did not hurry. It did not carve aggressively or change its mind often. It followed a long, patient path, as if confident that it would arrive eventually, no matter how slowly it took. This lack of urgency mattered. A river that does not rush does not demand attention. It allows observation. You can watch it without feeling threatened. You can leave and return, and it will still be there doing essentially the same thing. At first, this consistency went unnoticed. Water came and went. Silt accumulated. The land darkened briefly, then returned to its usual dryness. Nothing about this seemed extraordinary. The river was not spectacular. It did not impress. It repeated itself. Repetition is easy to ignore until it becomes useful. The Nile did not ask to be named. It did not claim identity. It simply continued year after year, performing the same quiet action with minor variations. It was not trying to build a relationship. It was not offering opportunity. It was just behaving consistently in a world where consistency was rare. Only much later would people realize that this was unusual. At the beginning, the river was simply part of the background. And backgrounds in history are often the most important elements precisely because no one notices them until they stop behaving as expected. For now, the Nile flowed unnamed, uncelebrated, and unconcerned with its future role. It had time, and it was in no hurry to become anything else. The comfort of a predictable current. As years passed, more years than anyone could count, the river continued its pattern. It rose gently, it spread thinly, it withdrew without drama. The land absorbed what it left behind, then everything waited. This cycle did not feel meaningful yet, it felt repetitive. And repetition, when uninterrupted, slowly becomes familiar. Familiarity is powerful. It reduces anxiety. It allows anticipation. It creates the possibility of trust. The Nile's flow was not impressive in its speed. It was impressive in its restraint. It did not surge unpredictably. It did not disappear without warning. Its current was steady enough to be learned. And once something can be learned, it can be relied upon. This is where the river began to matter, not because it changed, but because it did not. A predictable current changes how time is experienced. You stop reacting and start preparing. You stop fearing the unknown and start noticing patterns. The river did not force adaptation. It rewarded memory. For people encountering it later, this would become clear. But even before that, the land itself began to respond. Soil accumulated slowly, layer by layer, without disturbance. The river did not strip the land bare. It added quietly, patiently, without asking for attention. There is a subtle humor in this. A river that never tried to impress ended up becoming unforgettable. While louder rivers demanded respect through destruction, this one earned trust through consistency. Consistency encourages staying. If water behaves roughly the same way each year, movement becomes optional. You do not need to chase resources constantly. You can wait for them to return. The Nile did not offer abundance immediately. It offered reliability, and reliability, when given enough time, becomes more valuable than abundance ever could. At this point, the river was still just water moving through land, but it was quietly preparing the conditions for something that would depend entirely on its refusal to be dramatic. Flooding as a habit, not a crisis. When the Nile flooded, it did not behave like an emergency. It behaved like a routine. The water rose, spread, and receded with a rhythm that soon became familiar. There was no violence in it, no sudden destruction, just repetition. In most places, floods are events to survive. Here, flooding was something to expect. Expectation changes everything. When you expect disruption, you prepare for absence. When you expect return, you prepare for continuity. The flood did not arrive to test resilience. It arrived to refresh the land. Silt settled gently. Moisture lingered just long enough. Then the water left, almost politely, as if aware that staying too long would cause inconvenience. This behavior reduced fear. Fear is exhausting. A flood that arrives predictably does not inspire panic. It inspires planning. You adjust your life around it. You stop seeing it as an interruption and start seeing it as part of the year. The Nile's flooding did not teach urgency. It taught timing. This is an important distinction. Urgency demands reaction. Timing rewards patience. People who learn timing learn to wait, and waiting, when it works, feels intelligent rather than passive. Over time, the flood became a marker, not a disaster, not a miracle, just a signal that something familiar was happening again. That familiarity allowed memory to become useful. Knowledge accumulated not through crisis, but through calm repetition. Later, this cycle would be elevated into meaning. It would be named, measured, celebrated. But at the beginning, it was simply a habit, a river doing the same thing, often enough to stop being surprising. And habits, when shared across generations, become foundations. A river uninterested in drama. The Nile never tried to be exciting. It did not rush through narrow valleys. It did not roar. It did not demand to be crossed heroically. It moved with a patience that bordered on indifference. This indifference was misunderstood later as generosity, even kindness. In truth, the river was simply uninterested in drama. It did not respond to human presence. It did not adjust itself to ambition. It behaved the same way, regardless of who was watching. This made it trustworthy. A river that does not react emotionally allows people to relax. You can plan around it. You can align your work with its rhythm. You can depend on it without feeling challenged by it. There is something quietly amusing about how this worked. The river never tried to become central. People eventually built their lives entirely around it. The Nile did not ask for belief. It did not demand respect. It did not require rituals to continue flowing. It did what it always did, and in doing so, it allowed others to do the same. This absence of drama created space. Space for attention, space for repetition, space for systems to form slowly without urgency. Over time, this would allow coordination, planning, and shared expectation to develop. But none of that existed yet. For now, the river remained uninterested in its future reputation. It flowed, flooded, withdrew, and waited. It had no name, and it did not need one. Waiting for someone to notice. For a long time, the Nile existed without recognition. It was part of the landscape, not its center. People passed near it without committing. They observed without organizing. They benefited without depending. But repetition has consequences. Eventually, someone noticed that the river returned reliably. Someone noticed that the land behaved differently afterward. Someone noticed that waiting near the river worked better than leaving. These observations did not arrive all at once. They accumulated slowly across many lives. No one made a decision to trust the river. Trust emerged quietly through survival without surprise. This was the beginning not of Egypt, but of possibility. The Nile did not change to become important. People changed because it did not. They adjusted their lives to its rhythm, not because it demanded obedience, but because cooperation was easier than resistance. Before the river had a name, it already had influence. Before it was measured, it was already shaping behavior. Before it became symbolic, it was practical. And practicality, repeated long enough, becomes history. The Nile waited patiently for someone to stay. And when they finally did, it continued flowing, unchanged, as if nothing special had happened at all. That was its greatest contribution. People who didn't plan an empire. People who didn't plan an empire. Arriving without a destination. When people first reached the Nile Valley, they did not arrive with ideas. They arrived with tired legs, limited supplies, and the simple intention of making it through the next stretch of heat. This was not a journey toward greatness. It was movement driven by necessity, the kind that ends wherever resistance feels lowest. The valley did not announce itself as special. It did not promise success. It merely failed to push people away. That was enough. People stopped, not because they believed they had found something important, but because nothing immediately suggested they should keep going. They stayed briefly, at least that was the plan. Stay through the dry season, rest, recover, then move on. Temporary decisions are easy to make because they do not feel binding. You tell yourself you are only here for now. You are not committing. You are simply waiting. Waiting, however, has a habit of extending itself when conditions remain tolerable, and the Nile Valley remained tolerable with impressive consistency. No one surveyed the land and imagined monuments. No one outlined borders. There was no sense of beginning. There was only the quiet realization that this place did not punish delay. Staying felt neutral. Neutral places are rare. Most environments either reward speed or demand retreat. This one did neither. It allowed people to linger without consequence. And so they lingered. Survival without ambition. Life here did not feel like an opportunity. It felt manageable. Food could be found. Water returned. The land responded predictably enough to effort. This reduced urgency. Reduced urgency softened ambition. There was no need to extract everything immediately. No pressure to expand. Survival did not require boldness. It required attention. These early inhabitants were not dreamers. They were observers. They watched the river rise and fall. They noticed how the land changed afterward. They learned when to move slightly and when not to move at all. Nothing about this process felt heroic. It felt practical. And practicality has a way of sustaining itself quietly. The idea of building something lasting never appeared because nothing demanded it. Shelters were built to be useful, not impressive. Tools were shaped to last just long enough. Everything was provisional. But provisional arrangements, when repeated, begin to resemble structure. There is something almost humorous about how this works. People often imagine civilizations beginning with grand intention. In reality, they often begin with modest comfort. When daily life stops feeling like a crisis, imagination narrows. People focus on what works today rather than what might impress tomorrow. Here, survival did not push people to think bigger. It encouraged them to think calmer. The long pause. At some point, movement slowed. Not completely, just enough to notice. Groups returned to the same spots. Paths reappeared. Familiarity replaced exploration. The idea of leaving grew less urgent with each season that passed without incident. This was not a conscious choice. No one declared permanence. Permanence happened quietly, disguised as repetition. When you return to the same place often enough, it begins to expect you. When a place expects you, leaving starts to feel unnecessary. People told themselves they were still temporary. They just needed to wait one more season, then another, then one more again. Temporary arrangements stretched across lifetimes. Children were born into places their parents had never intended to stay. Memory deepened. Knowledge accumulated. The valley did not ask for loyalty. It did not demand belief. It simply behaved consistently enough to allow attachment to form without announcement. Attachment, once formed, does not need justification. It simply exists. This long pause mattered more than any decision. It allowed habits to develop. Habits outlast intentions. Settling without noticing. Settling rarely feels like settling while it is happening. It feels like convenience, like choosing the easier option one more time, like deciding not to pack everything up because nothing is forcing you to leave. People stored more than they carried. They repaired rather than replaced. They remembered instead of improvising. These choices did not feel historical. They felt efficient. Efficiency is persuasive. It encourages repetition. Repetition encourages structure. There were still no plans for expansion, no sense of destiny, just a growing familiarity with staying. Over time, familiarity becomes expectation. Expectation reshapes behavior. You begin to plan for return rather than departure. You build slightly sturdier shelters. You coordinate tasks. You share time. None of this was intentional empire building. It was the natural outcome of a place that made stillness practical. A temporary decision that stayed. By the time anyone might have thought to leave, leaving felt unnecessary. The temporary decision had lasted long enough to stop feeling temporary. What began as a pause had turned into a pattern, and patterns, once established, resist disruption. This is how Egypt truly began, not with ambition, not with conquest, not with vision, but with people who did not plan an empire and found themselves living in the early shape of one. They did not intend to stay forever. Forever simply arrived quietly, one familiar season at a time. The Nile Valley did not inspire greatness. It allowed continuity, and continuity, practiced long enough, eventually becomes history. When staying became smart. The moment movement quietly lost its advantage. For most of human history, movement had been the safest response to uncertainty. When food thinned out, you moved. When the weather turned hostile, you moved. When the land stopped cooperating, you moved again. Motion was survival. Stillness was hesitation. Hesitation often meant danger. This logic had shaped generations long before anyone reached the Nile Valley, and it did not disappear quickly. But here, something unusual began to happen. Movement slowly lost its advantage. Leaving did not improve conditions. Traveling farther did not reveal land that behaved better. Each journey outward required effort, risk, and memory to be rebuilt from the beginning. Each return to the valley, however, felt familiar. The river was still there. The land still responded the same way. The climate still behaved within a narrow, manageable range. Nothing dramatic rewarded departure. At first, people did not interpret this as a reason to stay. They interpreted it as temporary relief. Rest here. Recover here. Then move on, once strength returns. But strength returned without urgency. Hunger did not chase them away. Weather did not threaten to worsen suddenly. The land did not punish delay, and so delay extended itself. Movement became tiring rather than necessary. This shift was not celebrated. It was barely noticed. No one declared that staying was now the wiser choice. People simply found fewer reasons to leave. Each season that passed without crisis weakened the argument for motion. Each successful return weakened the fear of stillness. There is a quiet irony in this. A place does not need to be abundant to encourage settlement. It only needs to be predictable enough to reduce anxiety. Here, predictability softened decision-making. People stopped bracing themselves for the next emergency. They began to arrange their days instead. Staying did not feel ambitious. It felt economical. Carrying everything again required energy. Rebuilding required effort. Learning a new landscape required attention. Staying allowed knowledge to accumulate rather than reset. Tools could be left behind and reused. Paths did not need to be rediscovered. Familiarity reduced waste. This was not a philosophical shift. It was practical. When effort produces the same outcome repeatedly, humans choose the version that costs less. In the Nile Valley, Staying cost less than leaving. That calculation mattered more than any vision of permanence. Over time, movement began to feel excessive. Not dangerous, just unnecessary. The idea of leaving did not disappear, but it lost urgency. You could leave tomorrow, or the season after, or not at all. The absence of pressure allowed choice to slow down. And when choice slows down long enough, it becomes habit. This was the quiet moment when staying became smart. Not heroic, not visionary, simply sensible. The land did not trap people. It convinced them gently that moving on offered no clear improvement. Civilizations do not begin when people decide to build something great. They begin when people realize they no longer need to go anywhere else. Repetition as a quiet form of intelligence. Once staying became sensible, repetition followed naturally. People did not repeat their actions because they lacked creativity. They repeated them because repetition worked. Each season confirmed what the previous one had suggested. The river behaved as expected. The land responded predictably. Effort produced familiar results. Familiar results reduced anxiety. And reduced anxiety made repetition feel intelligent rather than lazy. In most places, repetition is punished. Environments change suddenly, forcing people to adapt or leave. Here, repetition was rewarded. Doing the same thing twice did not result in failure. It resulted in confirmation. Over time, confirmation becomes confidence. This kind of intelligence does not announce itself. It does not look impressive. It looks like routine. But routine, when it is stable, allows attention to deepen. People noticed small details because they were not constantly distracted by emergencies. They learned how the soil behaved after different floods. They learned where water lingered longest. They learned when effort mattered and when waiting was better. Waiting became useful. That alone was revolutionary. Repetition also changed how mistakes were treated. Errors did not result in immediate disaster. A poorly timed action could be corrected next season. A misjudgment did not erase everything learned before. This tolerance encouraged experimentation without fear. Small adjustments were possible because failure was survivable. There is something quietly ironic about this. A land that never demanded brilliance produced deep understanding. People became experts not by mastering complexity, but by living inside consistency. They did not conquer the environment. They memorized it. Over generations, repetition layered knowledge gently. Children grew up watching adults do the same things at the same times. Skills were not taught formally. They were absorbed. Memory became collective. Knowledge stopped belonging to individuals and began belonging to the place itself. This kind of intelligence is slow. It does not rush toward innovation. It refines what already exists. It values what continues to work. And because it is quiet, it is often underestimated. But this quiet intelligence is what makes long-term coordination possible. It allows people to share expectations without explanation. When everyone knows roughly what will happen next, cooperation becomes easy. And ease, when shared, changes everything. Predictability becomes a resource. Eventually, predictability itself became something people depended on. Not water alone, not soil alone, but the reliability of time. Knowing that the future would resemble the past closely enough to plan for it was the most valuable resource available. This changed how people thought about effort. Work was no longer defensive. It was preparatory. You worked not because you were afraid, but because you expected results. You stored food not out of panic, but because storing made sense. Planning extended slightly beyond immediate survival. The future stopped feeling abstract. It felt familiar. This familiarity softened social behavior. People coordinated naturally because coordination reduced repetition of effort. Tasks aligned. Timing mattered. When everyone knew roughly when things would happen, they could work together without command. This was not authority. It was convenience. There is a gentle humor in this. Structures that later looked like organization began as shortcuts. Sharing labor was easier than duplicating it. Sharing time was easier than improvising separately. Order emerged because disorder was inefficient. Predictability also changed risk. When outcomes are known, risk becomes calculable. People took modest risks because failure was unlikely to erase everything. This allowed gradual expansion without urgency. Life did not feel like a gamble. Over time, predictability shaped expectations. People expected continuity. They expected return. They expected tomorrow to behave reasonably. These expectations did not guarantee success, but they reduced fear. Fearless societies do not rush. This is where staying stopped being merely sensible and began to feel secure. Security did not arrive dramatically. It settled quietly, like dust accumulating unnoticed. And once it settled, it was difficult to imagine living without it. Cooperation without command. As staying became normal, cooperation followed without instruction. People did not need leaders to tell them when to work together. The environment did that. The river rose, the land responded, timing required alignment. Work synchronized naturally, tasks overlapped, shared effort reduced individual strain. Cooperation did not feel like obligation, it felt like relief. There was no vision of hierarchy yet, no ambition to organize beyond necessity. People cooperated because cooperation made days quieter. Quiet days are persuasive. This cooperation did not erase individuality. It aligned it. People still worked separately, but within shared rhythms. Over time, these rhythms became social expectations. You knew when to help. You knew when help would come. This kind of order does not require enforcement. It requires trust. Trust emerged because predictability allowed it. When people believe tomorrow will resemble today, promises feel safer. This was not governance, it was habit. Habit, repeated across generations, becomes structure without design. No one sat down to plan society. Society formed because coordination was easier than isolation. Later, this would be misunderstood as intention. Historians would search for planners, they would imagine foresight. In reality, most of this emerged from convenience. The land did not demand hierarchy. It allowed coordination. People did the rest, quietly. Staying as the new default. By the time anyone might have questioned it, staying had become the default. Leaving was possible but unnecessary. Movement required justification. Stillness did not. This was the final shift. The moment when remaining in place felt normal rather than provisional. When children grew up assuming return. When memory extended backward far enough to feel rooted. Nothing dramatic marked this change. No declaration. No moment of recognition. Permanence arrived disguised as familiarity. This is how civilizations actually begin. Not with ambition, but with comfort that lasts long enough to feel trustworthy. Not with conquest, but with repetition that refuses to break. The Nile Valley did not force this outcome, it allowed it. The land behaved, the river returned, time slowed, people adjusted. By the end of this chapter, Egypt still did not exist, but leaving no longer made sense. And once leaving stops making sense, history quietly begins to take shape. Agriculture without drama. Farming that never tried to impress. Agriculture in ancient Egypt did not begin as an experiment in progress. It was not ambitious. It did not seek efficiency at all costs, nor did it chase constant improvement. It existed for one simple reason. It worked well enough to be repeated, and repetition in this landscape was the highest form of success. The land did not demand aggressive farming. It did not require forceful extraction or endless innovation. The Nile arrived, deposited its silt, and withdrew. The soil responded, seeds grew, crops matured. This process did not fluctuate wildly. It did not surprise people often. Farming here did not feel like a struggle against nature. It felt like cooperation with a routine. There was no urgency to increase yields dramatically. Enough food was enough, excess was unnecessary. The environment discouraged extremes. Overplanting did not produce miracles. Underplanting did not invite disaster. Balance mattered more than ambition. This balance shaped behavior. Farmers did not chase novelty. They observed timing. They paid attention to when the land softened, when it hardened again, when planting made sense and when waiting was smarter. Improvement came through refinement, not reinvention. Small adjustments mattered more than bold changes. There is something quietly humorous about this. Later societies would celebrate innovation, disruption, and growth. Egyptian agriculture found none of that necessary. Stability was more valuable than speed. Predictability was more useful than abundance. The land rewarded patience, not cleverness. Those who worked within its rhythm succeeded. Those who tried to push beyond it found little benefit. Over time, this discouraged experimentation for its own sake. People learned that doing what worked yesterday would probably work tomorrow. This kind of farming does not produce dramatic stories. It produces continuity. Crops appeared when expected. Harvests followed established patterns. Food arrived neither early nor late. It arrived on time. And arriving on time turned out to be everything. Seasons that behaved themselves. The agricultural year in Egypt did not need interpretation. It did not require prediction or guesswork. The seasons followed the river. The river followed gravity. And gravity, fortunately, was reliable. Flooding came first, then retreat, then planting, then growth, then harvest. This sequence repeated with modest variation, enough to require attention, but not enough to cause anxiety. The land did not ask farmers to gamble. It allowed them to plan. Planning changed how people experienced time. Days gained purpose. Months developed character. The year became something familiar rather than threatening. When you know roughly what will happen next, fear recedes. Work becomes calmer. Egyptian agriculture did not depend on constant surveillance. It depended on timing. You did not need to watch the land every moment. You needed to know when to act. Knowing when to wait mattered just as much as knowing when to work. This reduced exhaustion. Farming elsewhere often demanded vigilance against sudden loss. Here, loss was rare enough to be absorbed. Failure did not usually erase everything. One bad season did not end survival. This resilience came not from abundance, but from predictability. There is a subtle irony here. A system so stable rarely inspires urgency. It invites routine, and routine once established becomes comforting. Farmers did not wake each day wondering if food would exist. They wondered only when it would be ready. This certainty softened life. It allowed energy to be spent elsewhere. Social bonds strengthened. Coordination improved. Anxiety diminished. Seasons did not demand interpretation. They behaved themselves. And in doing so, they taught people to behave themselves as well. No need for constant improvement. Egyptian agriculture did not improve rapidly because it did not need to. Yields remained consistent. Techniques remained familiar. Tools changed slowly. Knowledge accumulated gently. This absence of pressure created a culture that valued continuity over innovation. There was no reason to risk change when stability delivered results. Improvement, when it occurred, was cautious. Adjustments were tested slowly over years, not rushed through necessity. Later observers might mistake this for stagnation. In reality, it was confidence. Confidence that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to trust what already worked. There is a quiet elegance in this restraint. Progress did not define success. Survival did. Comfort mattered more than expansion. Food security mattered more than surplus. This allowed agriculture to blend seamlessly into life rather than dominate it. Farming was not an emergency response. It was a background activity. Something done regularly, without stress, without spectacle. The land did not reward ambition. It rewarded care. Care is slower than ambition. It does not demand attention. It accumulates quietly. And because food arrived reliably, society did not organize itself around constant production anxiety. Life had room to breathe. Food that arrived on time. Perhaps the most important feature of Egyptian agriculture was not abundance, but timing. Food arrived when it was needed, not early, not late, just in time. This had profound consequences. Storage mattered, but hoarding did not dominate life. Scarcity existed, but rarely escalated into crisis. Hunger was not constant. It was manageable. This created trust. Trust in the land, trust in the future, trust in one another. When food arrives on time, fear loses its grip. Fearless societies do not rush. They do not overreact. They do not chase extremes. The agricultural rhythm of Egypt encouraged moderation. Work was steady, not frantic. Rest was allowed. The future felt predictable enough to plan modestly. This predictability shaped everything that followed. Quiet abundance, lasting consequences. Agriculture without drama does not attract attention. It does not create legends. It creates longevity. Egyptian farming supported life quietly, consistently, and without demanding constant adaptation. This quiet success laid the foundation for everything else. Social organization, timekeeping, labor coordination, all of it depended on food that could be trusted to appear. Egypt did not rise because it produced extraordinary crops. It lasted because it produced reliable ones. The land did not reward ambition. It rewarded patience. And patience, practiced long enough, becomes civilization. Time counted quietly. when time stopped being abstract. For most of human existence, time had been something you endured rather than used. It arrived as weather, hunger, exhaustion, and darkness. You reacted to it. You survived it. You rarely controlled it. Days passed whether you noticed them or not, and seasons changed without asking for permission. Time was not measured. It was felt. In the Nile Valley, this relationship began to soften. Here, time did not rush past violently. It arrived in recognizable shapes. The river rose, the river withdrew. The land responded. Food grew. Life repeated. Each cycle resembled the last, closely enough to be remembered. Memory, when it becomes reliable, invites counting. Counting does not begin with numbers. It begins with expectation. People noticed that certain things happened in a familiar order. They noticed that waiting mattered. Acting too early or too late changed outcomes. Gradually, time stopped being a background threat and started becoming something you could cooperate with. Not master, not command. Simply align with. This was the first shift. Time became observable. When time is observable, it becomes useful. You begin to anticipate rather than react. You prepare rather than scramble. You notice intervals. Days are no longer interchangeable. They acquire character. Morning feels different from afternoon. Dry months feel different from wet ones. This did not happen suddenly. No one invented a calendar out of ambition. Time was counted quietly because it had proven itself predictable enough to count. Counting was not a symbol of intelligence. It was a response to stability. In this valley, time behaved politely, and polite things are easier to organize. Days, seasons, and the shape of the year. The Egyptian understanding of time grew outward from the river. The flood marked one phase. The retreat marked another. Growth followed. Harvest came last. This sequence repeated with enough consistency to divide the year naturally. Days became units of work and rest, not formally at first, simply practically. Light determined action. Darkness invited stillness. There was no need to debate this. The environment decided quietly. Seasons followed the river rather than the sky. This was important. In many places, seasons are abstract concepts tied to temperature or daylight. Here, seasons were visible. You could see them arrive and leave. You could watch time happen. This visibility made time feel tangible. It was no longer an invisible force pressing forward. It was a sequence you could recognize and prepare for. Preparation reduced anxiety. Reduced anxiety slowed life further. The year became a rhythm rather than a threat. This rhythm did not demand precision. It allowed approximation. You did not need exact dates. You needed relative timing. Early enough, late enough, just right. That was sufficient. There is something quietly humorous here. Later civilizations would obsess over accuracy. Egyptian timekeeping began with tolerance. Being roughly correct was enough. Perfection was unnecessary. This tolerance allowed time to integrate smoothly into life. It did not dominate thought. It supported it. Work aligned naturally. Rest followed without guilt. The year unfolded like a familiar story that did not require suspense. And when life lacks suspense, sleep comes easily. Time becomes a tool, not a tyrant. Once time could be anticipated, it could be used, not aggressively, gently. Time became a tool rather than a force to endure. You planned tasks because planning worked. You delayed actions because delay had benefits. You coordinated effort because coordination reduced waste. This was not control. It was cooperation. The calendar did not command behavior, it reflected it. It described what already happened reliably. Its authority came from observation, not decree. People trusted it because it matched experience. Timekeeping did not accelerate life. It slowed it further. There is a mild irony in this. Counting time is often associated with urgency, deadlines, pressure. In Egypt, counting time reduced pressure. It removed guesswork. It replaced fear with familiarity. You knew when work would begin. You knew when rest would follow. You knew roughly when food would be ready. This knowledge made patience practical. Waiting was no longer passive. It was informed. Informed waiting is deeply calming. Time once counted also became shareable. People aligned their expectations. Shared time created social coherence. You did not need constant instruction. Everyone knew roughly where in the cycle they were. This reduced conflict, reduced confusion, reduced noise. Time became quiet infrastructure. Living with the river's clock. The Nile was the true clock of Egypt. Not a mechanical device, not an abstract system. A river that arrived on schedule often enough to be trusted. People did not impose time on the river. They followed it. This distinction mattered. The river did not respond to human schedules. Humans adjusted theirs. This kept expectations realistic. You did not demand the impossible. You worked with what arrived. Living with the river's clock meant accepting limits. You could not hurry growth. You could not delay floods. You learned to act within narrow windows. Narrow windows encourage focus. This focus shaped daily life. Activities clustered naturally. Labor concentrated when needed. Rest followed when work was finished. Life developed a pulse rather than a constant push. That pulse was sustainable. Over generations, this rhythm shaped identity. People thought in cycles rather than lines. The future was not an endless stretch forward. It was a return to something familiar. That familiarity softened ambition. Expansion felt unnecessary when return was reliable. This is why Egypt endured. It did not chase time. It lived inside it. A civilization that learned to wait well. By the time Egypt began to resemble what we recognize as a civilization, time had already been domesticated, not captured, not conquered, but understood. Days, seasons, and years moved with purpose rather than threat. Life unfolded at a pace that could be sustained. Waiting was no longer wasted time. It was correct time. This shaped everything that followed. Authority emerged slowly. Organization grew gently. Power aligned itself with rhythm rather than force. Timekeeping did not accelerate progress, it stabilized it. Egypt did not become great by mastering time. It became enduring by respecting it. A civilization that knows when to wait rarely collapses suddenly. It absorbs change. It adapts gradually. It sleeps when it should. And in that quiet agreement with time, Egypt found something more valuable than speed. It found continuity. Order without urgency. When order appeared without an emergency. In many places, order arrives as a response to danger. Something breaks, Something threatens, something collapses. People organize because they must. Authority appears because chaos demands it. Rules are written because fear insists on boundaries. Order, in these cases, is reactive. It is loud. It announces itself. In the Nile Valley, order arrived differently. Nothing had gone wrong. There was no sudden crisis demanding coordination, no invasion, no famine severe enough to erase memory. Life was not perfect, but it was manageable. And because it was manageable, people had the unusual luxury of organizing calmly. Order here did not feel like rescue. It felt like convenience. As life settled into predictable rhythms, certain tasks began to overlap naturally. Planting required timing. Harvest required cooperation. Storage required shared attention. None of these needs were urgent on their own, but together they benefited from coordination. People began to align their actions, not because they were afraid, but because alignment reduced effort. This distinction matters. When order forms under pressure, it tends to be rigid. When it forms under calm conditions, it tends to be flexible. Egyptian social order did not need to shout. It did not need constant enforcement. It grew out of habits that already worked. People knew roughly when work would begin. They knew when rest would follow. They knew when shared effort mattered more than individual preference. These understandings did not require written rules. They were absorbed through repetition. There is a quiet irony here. A society that later appeared highly structured began without formal structure. Order emerged because life had slowed down enough to allow it. When nothing is on fire, you can arrange things thoughtfully. This early order did not feel political. It felt practical. It was not imposed. It was accepted because it made days smoother. And smooth days are persuasive. Coordination as the natural next step. Once people stopped rushing, coordination became possible. You cannot coordinate when everyone is focused on survival minute by minute. Coordination requires time, trust, and predictability. The Nile Valley offered all three. Tasks began to synchronize. People worked together because working together saved energy. Shared labor shortened effort. Shared timing reduced mistakes. Cooperation was not idealistic. It was efficient. No one needed to argue for it. This efficiency reshaped relationships. People became aware of one another's roles, not formally, practically. You knew who worked where. You knew who stored what. You knew when help would be useful and when it would be intrusive. This awareness did not create hierarchy immediately. It created rhythm. Rhythm matters more than rules in early societies. When everyone understands the flow of work, authority becomes unnecessary. People move together because it feels correct, not because someone commands it. Later observers often mistake this stage for simplicity. In reality, it requires deep mutual understanding. It requires trust that others will act when expected. That trust can only exist when time behaves reliably. Here, time behaved. Coordination extended beyond work. Rest aligned, gathering aligned, movement aligned. Life stopped feeling fragmented. Days felt coherent. This coherence reduced tension. Reduced tension allowed further coordination. It is worth noting how unremarkable this felt at the time. No one thought they were inventing social order. They were simply doing what made life quieter. Quiet solutions tend to last. Authority without anxiety. Eventually, certain roles became more visible. Someone needed to keep track of storage. Someone needed to remember timing. Someone needed to oversee shared effort. These roles did not emerge from ambition. They emerged from necessity that was calm rather than urgent. Authority appeared not as force, but as attention. Those who managed rhythms of work, of storage, of time became quietly influential, not because they demanded obedience, but because they reduced confusion. People listened because listening helped things run smoothly. This kind of authority does not rely on fear. It relies on usefulness. There is something gently amusing about this. Power often imagines itself dramatic. In Egypt, power began as administration of routine. It was subtle. It did not interrupt life. It organized it. Because authority emerged without crisis, it did not need to justify itself aggressively. It did not need spectacle. It did not need constant reinforcement. Its legitimacy came from results. Days went well. Food arrived on time. Conflicts remained small. People accepted guidance because guidance worked. This acceptance allowed authority to persist without urgency. Decisions were made slowly, changes were gradual. Nothing demanded immediate obedience. This reduced resistance. Resistance is often a response to pressure. Here, pressure was minimal. Authority settled into place, quietly, like furniture that no one remembers moving, but no one wants to remove. Managing rhythm instead of commanding people. What defined Egyptian order was not control over people, but management of rhythm. Work had a pace, seasons had a flow, life had intervals. Authority focused on keeping these intervals aligned. This is a crucial difference. Command tells people what to do. Rhythm tells people when to do it. Timing is less confrontational than instruction. People resist being told what to do. They rarely resist acting at the right moment. The Nile provided the master rhythm. Social order followed it. Tasks clustered naturally. Labor intensified when needed and eased when finished. This prevented exhaustion. Preventing exhaustion prevented rebellion. Life did not feel oppressive. It felt structured enough to be calm. This calm allowed social order to deepen without conflict. Rules did not multiply unnecessarily. Custom mattered more than law. Habit mattered more than punishment. People learned expectations through observation rather than enforcement. This made order feel natural rather than imposed. Natural order is difficult to disrupt because it does not feel like control. A society that organized itself slowly. By the time Egypt began to resemble a recognizable society, order was already deeply embedded, not as a system imposed from above, but as a network of shared expectations aligned with time, labor, and environment. There had been no emergency, no dramatic turning point. Order emerged because life had become predictable enough to allow it. Predictability created space. Space allowed coordination. Coordination produced authority. Authority stabilized rhythm. This process was slow, almost invisible. But invisibility is often the mark of durability. Egyptian social order did not rush. It did not need to. It grew alongside life rather than ahead of it. And because it grew slowly, it fit. This is why Egypt endured. Not because it was powerful early, but because it was orderly without anxiety. It organized life without demanding urgency. and a society that does not hurry rarely breaks suddenly. When routine turned into authority. When someone started keeping track. Authority in early Egypt did not announce itself. It did not arrive wearing symbols or carrying commands. It emerged quietly, the way routine always does, by repeating itself long enough that someone eventually noticed it needed care. Grain came in, at roughly the same time each year. Labor followed familiar rhythms. Work ended when it was expected to end. Nothing was dramatic, but everything was regular. Regular things invite attention. At first, that attention belonged to no one in particular. People simply remembered. They noticed how much grain usually arrived, how long it lasted, how many hands were needed when the work began. Memory was enough until it wasn't. When life becomes predictable, forgetting becomes the greatest risk. And so someone began to remember on purpose. This was not leadership in the heroic sense. It was maintenance. Someone kept track because keeping track reduced confusion. Grain disappeared less often when it was counted. Labor moved more smoothly when someone knew who was present and who was not. Time felt calmer when someone remembered where in the cycle everyone stood. There was no announcement that authority had arrived. No one claimed power. People simply started listening to the person who remembered best, not out of fear, but out of relief. Confusion is tiring. Clarity is comforting. This is the quiet origin of authority. Usefulness. Those who managed routine did not command behavior. They organized it. They did not invent rules. They reflected habits that already worked. Their influence came from alignment with life rather than control over it. Authority felt less like pressure and more like support. There is a subtle irony here. Power is often imagined as forceful and visible. In early Egypt, it was clerical. Counting mattered. Recording mattered. Not because it created dominance, but because it preserved calm. Calm, in this environment, was the most valuable resource of all. As routines grew more complex, the need for attention grew with them. Someone needed to know when grain should be stored, when it should be released, when work should begin, and when it should stop. These decisions were not political. They were temporal. They managed rhythm rather than people. And because rhythm was already trusted, those who managed it became trusted as well. Authority did not rise from ambition. It rose from repetition that needed protection. It was born not to expand control, but to keep familiar things from falling out of place. And because it asked for nothing dramatic, it was accepted without resistance. Power entered Egypt softly, disguised as memory doing its job. Storage, grain, and the shape of trust. Storage changed the meaning of time in early Egypt. Grain was no longer something that appeared and vanished within a season. It could wait. It could be held. It could return later when need quietly arrived. This simple shift altered trust, responsibility, and expectation, all without raising voices or declaring rules. Storing grain required attention rather than force. Someone needed to watch quantities, locations, and timing. Too much released too early created waste. Too little released too late created fear. Balance mattered, and balance demanded memory. Those who kept that memory became important, not because they owned food, but because they protected its rhythm. Early taxation did not feel like extraction. It felt like smoothing time. Grain moved forward from abundance into scarcity, from good seasons into bad ones. People contributed not to empower a state, but to reduce uncertainty. The act felt practical, almost invisible. Nothing was taken dramatically. Everything was returned predictably. Trust grew slowly. When stored grain reappeared during lean periods, confidence followed. People learned that contribution did not mean loss. It meant delay. Delay, when respected, feels safe. Safe systems encourage cooperation without resistance. Authority deepened here quietly. Those managing storage did not threaten punishment. They offered continuity. Their decisions mattered because they worked. When food arrived as expected, no one argued with the process. Silence is often the highest form of approval. There is something gently ironic about this stage. One of history's earliest states gained legitimacy not through power displays but through reliable accounting. Numbers mattered more than speeches. Records mattered more than symbols. The state, in its earliest form, behaved like a careful caretaker rather than a conqueror. Storage also shaped social behavior. People planned farther ahead. Anxiety shortened. Hoarding lost purpose. When tomorrow felt manageable, generosity became easier. Cooperation felt rational. The authority that formed around grain was not absolute. It was conditional. It lasted only as long as trust lasted. And trust depended entirely on rhythm being respected. This kept power restrained. Abuse would have been obvious. Failure would have been immediate. Thus, early Egyptian authority learned caution. It learned patience. It learned that maintaining order required listening to time rather than bending it. Grain storage did not create domination. It created confidence. Confidence, once shared, becomes structure. And structure, when it protects routine, becomes quietly powerful. In this way, routine matured into authority that felt natural, restrained, and almost invisible, guiding daily life gently forward without urgency, spectacle, or fear, while quietly aligning people, labor, and time together at last. Labor organized without needing force. Labor in early Egypt did not begin as something imposed. No one arrived with orders demanding obedience. Work organized itself because timing required it. The river rose, the fields softened. Planting needed many hands at once, and later harvesting did the same. Coordination emerged not from pressure, but from necessity that felt calm rather than urgent. People worked together because it shortened effort. Tasks finished sooner when shared. Fatigue decreased. Cooperation made the day quieter. This was persuasive. No speeches were needed to convince anyone that working together was preferable to working alone. Authority appeared here as scheduling rather than command. Someone needed to know when labor should begin and when it should end. Someone needed to remember who had worked recently and who had not. This attention reduced imbalance. It prevented resentment from forming quietly in the background. When rest followed work reliably, people accepted labor willingly. There is a subtle humor in this arrangement. One of history's earliest organized labor systems succeeded by respecting limits. Work was seasonal. It had a beginning and an end. Authority that ignored these boundaries would have disrupted rhythm, and disruption was immediately noticeable. This made restraint not only ethical, but practical. Because labor followed predictable cycles, coercion was unnecessary. People knew when their effort would be required and when it would stop. Predictability reduced resistance. Resistance often grows when work feels endless. Here it did not. Those who coordinated labor gained influence because they protected balance. They did not demand loyalty. They preserved rhythm. Their authority felt temporary, tied to the season, tied to necessity. This prevented power from hardening too quickly. Work groups became familiar. Trust developed. People learned one another's pace. Cooperation improved naturally. No formal hierarchy was required to make this function. Memory and expectation did the work. This system also limited ambition. There was no incentive to demand constant labor. Exhaustion would disrupt future cycles. Authority learned quickly that preserving energy preserved stability. Thus, labor organization strengthened authority quietly, not through force, but through reliability. When work felt fair, authority felt acceptable. When authority felt acceptable, it endured. Routine transformed labor into structure. Structure transformed coordination into power. And power, because it respected rhythm, remained calm, patient, and largely uncontested, guiding society forward without urgency, noise, or visible strain, while quietly shaping the foundations of a state that preferred balance over domination and continuity over conquest. A state that preferred things to stay in place. Early Egyptian authority did not imagine itself as expansive or ambitious. It preferred stillness. Its purpose was not to reach farther, but to keep existing things from drifting out of place. Grain belonged in storage until needed. Labor belonged in seasons rather than endless demand. Time belonged to cycles, not acceleration. Authority formed around this preference, quietly guarding positions rather than chasing growth. This attitude shaped the earliest form of the Egyptian state. Administration focused on placement, balance, and timing. Goods moved carefully. Records existed to prevent loss, not to impress. Decisions aimed to reduce friction rather than display strength. The state did not see expansion as success. Stability was success. Keeping grain, people, and effort where they functioned best was considered achievement enough. There is a gentle irony in this restraint. A system that avoided spectacle became remarkably durable because nothing dramatic was promised, nothing dramatic was required to maintain legitimacy. Authority did not rely on constant demonstration. It relied on familiarity. People trusted arrangements that remained unchanged. The state became background rather than centerpiece, supporting daily life without demanding attention. This preference for keeping things aligned limited power as much as it created it. Authority existed to correct drift, not to impose direction. When something moved too quickly or too far, it was gently returned to position. Excess labor was reduced. Excess accumulation was restrained. The goal was equilibrium. Equilibrium required awareness, patience, and refusal to hurry. Expansion introduces uncertainty. Growth complicates rhythm. Early Egyptian authority avoided both. It preferred a scale it could remember. Systems remained small enough to understand, large enough to function. This balance reduced anxiety. Reduced anxiety reduced conflict. Conflict was inefficient. Efficiency, once discovered, becomes policy even when no one names it. By choosing maintenance over momentum, the state embedded itself into routine. Routine protected order. Order reduced fear. Fearlessness allowed authority to persist quietly. Power settled into place without announcement, like tools returned to familiar shelves. Nothing advanced rapidly, but nothing fell apart. And in that careful stillness, authority learned its preferred shape. This shape of power would later appear impressive only in retrospect. At the time, it felt ordinary. Authority worked best when unnoticed, correcting imbalance before it became visible. By keeping everything roughly where it belonged, the state preserved calm. Calm preserved trust. Trust preserved continuity. Continuity, repeated quietly across generations, turned routine into something lasting without ever needing urgency or spectacle. It remained powerful, precisely because it resisted excess, noise, and haste, choosing balance over ambition every single day. When routine and power became the same thing. By the time routine fully settled into authority, nothing dramatic marked the change. No declaration arrived, no banner was raised. Power felt familiar because it had grown inside daily habits rather than above them. People woke, worked, stored, rested, and returned to the same expectations, and those expectations quietly shaped obedience without asking for it. This final stage of early Egyptian authority depended on continuity more than command. What mattered was not who ruled, but whether rhythm held. Grain moved when expected. Labor gathered and dispersed on schedule. Disputes remained small because timing prevented pressure from accumulating. Authority proved itself by keeping days smooth rather than by promising transformation. There is a mild, almost comforting irony here. One of history's longest-lasting states did not begin by trying to be powerful. It began by trying to be correct. Correct timing, correct placement, correct balance. When these were maintained, people rarely questioned leadership. When they were disturbed, dissatisfaction appeared immediately. This feedback kept power cautious. Because authority was woven into routine, it was difficult to separate from life itself. To reject it would have meant rejecting the systems that made living easier. Power did not stand apart as an institution. It lived inside storage rooms, work schedules, and shared memory. It felt less like control and more like coordination. This arrangement discouraged excess. Leaders who pushed too hard disrupted rhythm and lost trust. Leaders who respected limits preserved calm. Over time, this rewarded restraint. Ambition softened. Continuity became the highest value. Authority learned that remaining invisible was often safer than demanding recognition. Routine had become self-reinforcing. Each successful season confirmed the system. Each confirmation deepened acceptance. Authority no longer needed to assert itself. It was assumed, like the river's return or the sun's rise. Its power came from reliability rather than force. In this way, early Egypt discovered a form of governance that matched its environment. Slow, repetitive, predictable, and resistant to urgency. The state did not hurry because the land did not hurry. Time moved in cycles, not lines. Power followed the same shape. By the end of this process, routine and authority were indistinguishable. What began as careful attention had become structure. What began as memory had become order. And because this order asked for patience instead of fear, it endured quietly, settling into history without noise, spectacle, or the need to explain itself to anyone at all. It lasted because it matched time's pace, favored restraint, avoided urgency, and allowed life to continue gently, reliably, and unremarkably onward forever. Stone, mud, and low expectations. Materials that did not dream of grandeur. Stone and mud were never meant to impress. In the Nile Valley, they were simply available, waiting without ambition. Long before monuments demanded attention, these materials shaped daily life quietly, accepting hands, weight, and time without complaint. They did not promise permanence. They promised usefulness. Mud came first. It arrived with the river, soft, workable, and forgiving. It could be shaped quickly, repaired easily, and abandoned without regret. Walls rose knowing they would fall. Floors hardened knowing they would soften again. This was not failure. It was understanding. Buildings were made to serve seasons, not eternity. Stone appeared later and cautiously. It was heavy, difficult, and slow to work. It asked for patience rather than inspiration. When stone was used, it was used where it mattered most, not everywhere. Foundations, thresholds, edges that needed to endure repeated contact. Stone did not replace mud. It supported it. This balance reflected expectations. Life here was stable but not indulgent. Resources were respected, not exaggerated. Construction followed need rather than vision. There was no pressure to build larger than required. Size created responsibility. Responsibility required effort. Effort was measured carefully. There is a quiet humor in how modest this was. Later generations would look back and search for symbolism. At the time, there was only practicality. Walls kept out heat. Roofs provided shade. Structures existed to be used, not admired. Low expectations made maintenance possible. When buildings were not expected to last forever, repairing them felt reasonable. When materials were familiar, replacement felt normal. Nothing needed defending as sacred. Everything could be adjusted. This approach shaped society subtly. People invested in continuity rather than display. They built spaces for living, working, storing, and resting. They did not build statements, they built shelter. Stone and mud taught restraint. They encouraged repetition over innovation. They rewarded care rather than ambition. In a land that valued rhythm, these materials fit perfectly. Egyptian architecture did not begin with dreams of eternity. It began with hands in mud and stone placed carefully where it would not need to move. From such modest choices, durability quietly emerged. Over time, these choices accumulated into habits, habits into norms, and norms into traditions that favored repair, reuse, and patience, allowing buildings to age gracefully, people to adapt calmly, and communities to remain grounded without chasing permanence, spectacle, or unnecessary scale. This steady modesty shaped expectations, limited ambition, and made longevity feel ordinary, achievable, and sufficient. Building for use, not for memory. Building in early Egypt was never about leaving a message behind. It was about making tomorrow slightly easier than today. Structures were planned with short attention spans, not because people lacked imagination, but because imagination was unnecessary. The land already worked. The river returned. Life continued. Buildings only needed to keep pace with that rhythm. Most structures were meant to be lived in, leaned against, repaired, and eventually replaced. This expectation shaped everything. Walls were thick enough to hold shade, not admiration. Doorways were placed where movement made sense, not where symmetry demanded. Nothing was aligned for spectacle. Everything was aligned for habit. Mud brick made this philosophy possible. It aged honestly, cracks appeared without drama, repairs were expected, maintenance became part of routine life rather than a sign of failure. When something collapsed, it did not feel tragic. It felt timely. Rebuilding did not interrupt identity. It reinforced it. Stone entered this world carefully, almost reluctantly. It was reserved for points of stress, places that endured repeated contact, edges that needed to remain stable. Stone was not celebrated. It was respected. Its presence suggested caution rather than ambition. Using stone meant committing to patience, because stone demanded time in return. This division of materials created a hierarchy of expectations. Mud accepted change. Stone resisted it. Both had their place. Neither was asked to become something else. Buildings reflected this balance. They were stable enough to trust, flexible enough to adjust. There is something quietly ironic here. A civilization later associated with permanence began with an architecture that assumed impermanence. By expecting change, it reduced fear of it. By planning for repair, it avoided crisis. This mindset extended beyond buildings. It shaped social life as well. Spaces were communal by necessity. Storage areas, workspaces, and living quarters overlapped naturally. This reduced isolation. It encouraged coordination. Buildings supported social rhythm rather than individual display. No one needed privacy from history. They needed shade, storage, and rest. Because buildings were not meant to last forever, people did not measure success by endurance. They measured it by usefulness. A structure was successful if it worked today and could be fixed tomorrow. That was enough. This approach limited ambition gently. When architecture does not promise immortality, power remains grounded. Authority does not hide inside monuments. It lives inside routines. Buildings supported life rather than overshadowed it. Stone and mud, used this way, shaped a culture comfortable with repair, repetition, and modest continuity. They did not demand memory. They allowed life to continue without asking to be remembered. Repair as a normal way of living. In the Nile Valley, repair was never a sign that something had gone wrong. It was simply part of how things continued. Walls cracked, floors softened, roofs sagged slightly under heat and time. None of this caused alarm, it caused preparation. People expected wear, and expectation softened every response to it. Because buildings were made with materials that aged visibly, deterioration felt honest. You could see what needed attention. Nothing failed suddenly. Mud brick did not hide its condition. It announced it quietly, long before collapse. This gave people time to patch, to reinforce, to adjust. Time prevented panic. Repair fit naturally into daily rhythm. It did not interrupt life. It accompanied it. While one person worked the fields, another mixed mud. While storage was checked, walls were checked too. Maintenance was not a separate activity reserved for crisis. It was woven into routine. This had consequences beyond architecture. A culture that repairs regularly develops patience. It does not expect perfection. It expects effort over time. Small corrections matter more than dramatic replacements. This mindset shaped relationships, labor, and authority as much as it shaped buildings. There is something quietly comforting about this approach. When repair is normal, nothing feels irreparable. Mistakes do not escalate into disasters. Damage does not feel final. This reduces fear. Reduced fear encourages calm decision-making. Stone reinforced this philosophy rather than contradicting it. When stone was used, it was placed where repair would be difficult but infrequent. Foundations, thresholds, and load-bearing edges benefited from durability. Stone did not eliminate repair. It delayed it. And delay in this environment was valuable. The The contrast between stone and mud created awareness. People understood which parts of life needed flexibility and which needed firmness. This understanding extended metaphorically. Some customs could change easily. Others needed stability. Knowing the difference mattered. There is an irony worth noticing. Later cultures would interpret permanence as strength. Early Egypt found strength in adaptability. Buildings survived not because they resisted change completely, but because they allowed controlled change without collapse. Repair also limited excess ambition. When rebuilding is expected, overbuilding feels unnecessary. Grand structures invite large failures. Modest ones invite manageable repairs. This kept scale appropriate. Communities grew without overwhelming themselves. In this way, architecture quietly taught restraint. It encouraged people to invest in continuity rather than spectacle. Structures aged alongside those who used them. Nothing stood apart from daily life. Everything participated in it. Stone and mud, treated this way, created a landscape where maintenance felt natural and decline felt temporary. Life did not aim for permanence. It aimed for continuity. And continuity, supported by routine repair, proved more durable than any single attempt at immortality. Spaces that served rhythm, not status. Buildings in the Nile Valley did not compete with one another. They did not attempt to stand out or dominate space. They settled into it. Homes, storage rooms, workshops, and shared courtyards followed the same quiet logic. Serve the rhythm of daily life, then step back. Architecture here did not ask to be admired. It asked to be useful at the right moment. Layouts favored movement over display. Paths were short. Doorways aligned with habit rather than symmetry. Rooms were sized for work, rest, and storage, not ceremony. Nothing encouraged lingering admiration. Everything encouraged continuation. When you entered a space, you understood immediately what it was for. This practicality shaped social life. Shared spaces mattered because tasks overlapped. Grain was stored near where it was processed. Tools rested close to where they were used. People crossed paths naturally without planning. Interaction was not staged. It happened because space allowed it to happen easily. There is a gentle humor in how status was treated. Buildings did not announce rank. Materials did not change dramatically from one dwelling to another. Differences existed, but they were quiet. Authority did not separate itself behind walls of spectacle. It remained close to routine, visible through function rather than display. This kept social distance manageable. Power felt present but not elevated. Leaders occupied spaces that worked, not spaces that impressed. This reduced resentment. When authority shares the same physical environment, it feels accountable without being confronted. Mud brick encouraged this equality. It limited extravagance by its very nature. Large structures required constant repair. Excessive scale created unnecessary labor. Restraint became practical wisdom. Stone, when used, supported function rather than hierarchy. Thresholds endured traffic. Foundations carried weight. These choices reinforced rhythm instead of hierarchy. Architecture also shaped memory. When buildings changed slowly and predictably, people remembered their lives through use rather than monument. Childhood was recalled by courtyards, shade, and familiar walls, not by grand facades. Memory attached itself to routine. This attachment deepened continuity. Places felt known across generations, not because they lasted unchanged, but because they changed in recognizable ways. Familiarity replaced reverence. People belonged to spaces without needing them to symbolize anything larger. In such an environment, ambition softened. When status is not reinforced by buildings, it must rely on service. Authority proved itself by maintaining spaces, not by owning them. This kept power grounded in daily life. Stone and mud, arranged this way, supported a society that valued flow over fixation. Spaces existed to keep life moving gently forward, to support work when needed, rest when possible, and interaction without effort. Architecture did not elevate anyone above rhythm. It served rhythm faithfully. Durability born from modesty. By the time anyone might have noticed how long things had lasted, durability was already established. Not because buildings were indestructible, but because expectations were modest. Nothing was asked to survive forever. Everything was asked to survive long enough. This distinction mattered more than strength. In the Nile Valley, longevity did not come from resistance to change. It came from cooperation with it. Mud brick accepted weather, heat, and time without protest. Stone accepted weight and repetition without drama. Together they created structures that aged honestly. When something weakened, it showed. When it failed, it did so gradually. Gradual failure allowed response. Response preserved continuity. This attitude extended beyond construction. People did not expect systems to be flawless. They expected them to be repairable. This softened disappointment. When things went wrong, they felt correctable rather than catastrophic. Catastrophe thrives on unrealistic expectations. Egypt avoided it by lowering them gently. There is a quiet irony here. A civilization remembered for monuments began by refusing monumentality. By keeping scale reasonable, maintenance remained possible. By avoiding excess, effort stayed proportional. Buildings did not outgrow the people who cared for them. This balance kept life manageable. Durability emerged as a side effect. Structures endured because they were never pushed beyond purpose. Communities endured because they were not overextended. Authority endured because it did not separate itself, physically or symbolically, from routine life. Everything stayed close to use. Over generations, this modesty created trust. People trusted spaces to function. They trusted systems to continue. They trusted that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to feel familiar. Familiarity, repeated long enough, becomes attachment. Attachment becomes identity. Later ages would reinterpret this endurance as intention. They would imagine grand plans, eternal visions, deliberate permanence. In reality, most of what lasted did so because no one demanded too much from it. Survival was not dramatized, it was normalized. Stone and mud, treated without illusion, taught patience. They taught people to invest in care rather than spectacle. They taught societies to grow inwardly stable before reaching outwardly impressive. This lesson shaped Egypt deeply. By the end of this chapter, architecture had done its quiet work. It had limited ambition without suppressing life. It had supported rhythm without freezing it. It had made continuity feel ordinary. This is how durability truly forms. Not through grandeur, but through restraint. Not through declarations, but through daily use. Egypt did not last because it aimed for eternity. It lasted because it aimed for tomorrow. Again and again. Without asking too much from land, materials, or time itself. Egypt before it knew. It was eternal. before permanence had a name. Before Egypt imagined itself as eternal, it was simply consistent. Long before pyramids claimed attention, before stone learned how to point toward the sky, life along the Nile had already settled into something stable enough to forget about ambition. This was a society that functioned without symbols. It did not need to prove its endurance because it was too busy experiencing it quietly. There were no monuments demanding memory, no architecture insisting on significance. Daily life unfolded without reference to posterity. People woke, worked, stored, rested, and returned to the same rhythms without imagining an audience beyond the present season. Survival was not dramatic. It was repetitive. And repetition, when uninterrupted, does not feel historic. It feels normal. This is the version of Egypt history often overlooks. A society already ordered, already confident in its routines, already capable of lasting yet uninterested in declaring that fact. Stability existed before symbolism. Continuity preceded ideology. Egypt did not set out to be remembered. It set out to remain functional. Time passed without commentary. Generations followed one another quietly. Knowledge moved through practice rather than proclamation. Authority managed rhythm rather than identity. Architecture supported use rather than meaning. Nothing asked to be eternal. Everything asked to work. There is a subtle irony in this. The civilization later defined by permanence began in a state of comfortable impermanence. Buildings were repaired, not preserved. Customs adapted gently. Power shifted slowly. No one feared change because change rarely threatened structure. The society was flexible enough to absorb variation without collapsing. This flexibility masked endurance because nothing felt fragile, nothing felt urgent. History, which tends to notice only moments of crisis or display, had little reason to pay attention. Egypt did not announce itself as special. It blended into its environment so effectively that it almost disappeared from notice. People did not yet see themselves as guardians of eternity. They were caretakers of routine. Their world did not stretch infinitely forward. It looped reliably back on itself. The future was expected to resemble the past, closely enough to trust it. This trust shaped behavior deeply. Planning remained modest. Ambition stayed contained. Identity formed around continuity rather than destiny. Egypt existed fully before it understood itself as exceptional. Only later would permanence become an idea. Only later would stone be asked to remember what people never felt the need to declare. At this stage, Egypt was already enduring, but without knowing it. It lived comfortably inside time, not above it. And because it did not yet imagine eternity, it achieved something rarer, a society stable enough that history had not yet learned how to interrupt it. Life that did not need symbols. Before symbols appeared, life already made sense. There were no images demanding reverence, no structures insisting on meaning beyond use. Objects existed because they worked. Practices survived because they were useful. Identity did not require visual reinforcement. People recognized their world through repetition rather than representation. This absence of symbolism was not emptiness. It was confidence. When a society functions smoothly, it does not rush to explain itself. Explanation often appears when something feels uncertain. Here, uncertainty was low. The land behaved, the river returned, food arrived. Authority coordinated quietly. Nothing demanded justification. Daily life unfolded without ceremony. Work was done because it was time to work. Rest followed because effort had ended. There was no need to elevate these actions into statements. They were sufficient on their own. Sufficiency is often mistaken for simplicity, but it is actually stability wearing modest clothing. Objects reflected this mindset. Tools were shaped for durability, not identity. Spaces were arranged for movement, not display. Clothing marked function rather than status. Differences existed, but they were not exaggerated. Social life remained legible without symbols because everyone shared the same rhythm. There is a gentle irony here. Later civilizations would surround themselves with signs to declare who they were. Egypt at this stage already knew who it was through habit alone. Symbols would eventually arrive not to create identity, but to preserve it when change began to accelerate. Without symbols, memory lived in practice. Knowledge passed through watching rather than teaching. Children learned by doing what adults did. No formal instruction was needed. Life itself served as explanation. This made continuity effortless. Nothing needed defending, nothing needed announcing. Society flowed forward quietly, confident that tomorrow would resemble today, closely enough to feel familiar. History, which prefers declarations, passed by without noticing. Stability without self-awareness. Egypt existed long before it recognized itself as something lasting. This lack of self-awareness mattered. A society that does not think of itself as eternal does not behave defensively. It adapts without panic. It changes without fear of losing identity. Stability here was experienced, not conceptualized. People did not ask whether their way of life would last. They assumed it would because it always had. Assumption is powerful. It shapes behavior quietly. This assumption reduced urgency. There was no rush to secure legacy, no pressure to monumentalize the present. Effort went into maintenance rather than memory. Systems were refined rather than frozen. Authority remained flexible. Custom evolved slowly. Flexibility preserved endurance. When change arrived, it did not feel threatening. It felt manageable. The society absorbed variation rather than resisting it. This prevented rupture. There is something subtly humorous about this. The civilization most associated with eternity achieved it accidentally by never trying to claim it early. Eternity became visible only in hindsight. At this stage, Egypt moved gently forward without reflection. Reflection often arrives when disruption forces it. Here, disruption was minimal. Life remained steady enough to continue without commentary. History had not yet found its narrative hook. When history was not paying attention. History notices noise. It notices collapse, conquest, and declaration. It rarely notices stability unfolding calmly. Early Egypt offered little drama. There were no sudden transformations, no radical breaks, no urgent stories. From a historical distance, this makes early Egypt appear invisible, but invisibility was its strength. While other societies flared briefly and disappeared, Egypt continued quietly, unremarkable enough to avoid interruption. Daily life lacked spectacle. Authority avoided excess. Architecture remained modest. Social order functioned without conflict. None of this attracted attention. History, distracted elsewhere, looked away. This allowed Egypt to deepen its routines without interference. Identity formed organically. Memory layered gently. Power matured cautiously, all without needing recognition. Only later, when symbols emerged and monuments rose, would history finally look back and realize something had been happening all along. By then, Egypt was already old. Eternity arrives late. Eternity did not arrive as a goal, it arrived as a realization. Only after centuries of continuity did Egypt begin to recognize its own endurance. Symbols emerged not to create permanence, but to acknowledge it. Stone rose when memory needed reinforcement. Writing appeared when repetition needed record. Eternity became an idea when time accelerated enough to require preservation. But before that moment, Egypt had already lasted. This is the quiet conclusion. A society does not need to know it is eternal to become so. It needs rhythm, restraint, and patience practiced long enough to feel ordinary. Egypt achieved eternity without aiming for it. And because it did not rush toward permanence, permanence found it anyway. History arrived late to the story. A civilization that never needed to rush. Ancient Egypt did not endure because it wanted to become great. It endured because it never felt pressured to become anything else. Ambition, which often drives societies toward noise and collapse, remained quiet here. Life worked. The river returned. The land responded. When a place functions reliably, urgency loses its grip. Egypt did not expand because it did not need to escape its present. It did not reinvent itself constantly because reinvention solved no immediate problem. Change was possible, but unnecessary. Stability, once achieved, proved comfortable enough to trust. Trust, when repeated across generations, becomes attachment. The earth itself played a role in this calm. Geography allowed repetition. Climate discouraged extremes. The Nile offered rhythm rather than surprise. None of these forces demanded haste. Together they created a rare condition, a place where staying felt reasonable year after year. When staying works, movement feels wasteful. This is the quiet foundation of endurance. Egypt did not cling to the past out of fear. It returned to it out of familiarity. The future was not imagined as an escape from the present. It was expected to resemble it closely enough to plan without anxiety. Time moved in cycles, not lines. Life unfolded without deadlines. There is a gentle irony here. Civilizations that hurry often do so because they sense instability. They build quickly, expand rapidly, and declare loudly, hoping momentum will outrun collapse. Egypt felt no such pressure. It moved slowly because nothing was chasing it. When people do not feel chased, they listen. They observe. They refine rather than replace. This is how continuity forms. Not through ambition, but through attention sustained over long stretches of calm. The land allowed Egypt to remain, and Egypt, noticing no reason to leave, accepted the invitation quietly. Generation after generation lived within the same rhythms, adjusting details rather than direction. Identity formed through habit rather than declaration. Memory accumulated gently without needing monuments at first. Only later would Egypt realize how long it had stayed. Only later would eternity become a concept worth naming. By then, endurance was already part of daily life. History arrived late to the realization, mistaking patience for intention and continuity for design. Egypt did not set out to last forever. It simply found itself in a place where forever did not feel demanding. The earth slowed enough. Time behaved kindly. Change arrived gradually. And so they stayed. They stayed not because they were told to, not because they dreamed of eternity, but because nothing, at any point, gave them a compelling reason to hurry away. And that quietly was enough. Ancient Egypt did not survive because it chased eternity. It survived because it never felt late. Nothing in its world demanded speed. The river returned when expected. The land responded without argument. Seasons followed one another with enough patience to make planning feel safe. When life offers no urgency, ambition softens on its own. Egypt stayed because staying worked. There was no grand decision, no dramatic refusal to change. Change simply arrived slowly enough to be absorbed. When tomorrow looks enough like today, movement loses its appeal. Leaving feels unnecessary. Reinvention feels wasteful. Continuity becomes the most reasonable choice. This was not a civilization built on desire for permanence, but on comfort with repetition. Earth allowed one place to remain calm for a very long time, and the people living there noticed that calm, trusted it, and quietly shaped their lives around it. They did not hurry history forward. They allowed history to arrive on its own. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson Egypt leaves behind. Endurance does not always come from strength, vision, or conquest. Sometimes it comes from knowing when nothing needs to be done, from recognizing that stability is already present, from understanding that not every moment asks for change. As this long story settles, there is no final event to mark, no collapse, no triumph, just continuation. Life carrying on at a pace that allows breathing to slow, thoughts to soften, and attention to rest. And so as you listen in these late hours, let this calm remain with you. Let the idea that not everything must rush offer some relief. History, at its quietest, is not a series of dramatic moments. It is a long agreement between people, land, and time to move gently together. Thank you for staying here, for listening patiently, and for letting these slow histories unfold beside you. If the night feels quieter now, you're welcome to rest inside it. We'll be here again whenever you feel ready to return. Good night, and sleep gently.